So this video is about fungi and early art, and I'm going to start back about 40,000 years ago to cave paintings, and we'll go all the way up to about the 17th century to the mosques in the Middle East. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about myself. My name is Angel Schatz, and I live in Austin, Texas, and I worked in digital design and animation for about 15 years, and working in the corporate office environment indoors, I could sort of feel my own mortality, and so I was able to transition into the analog world, jump back into nature, do things like, forage mushrooms, learn more about the natural world, and now I'm doing everything from foraging for local farm-to-table restaurants, doing organic farming, facilitating art workshops, and more. And so my interest in mushrooms started at a pretty young age when I would go out with my granddad. I grew up in the Midwest, and we would hunt for morels. And so this was rekindled when I found out morels grew in Texas. And so over the years, I've gotten better at identification. And here are some of my melfies, my mushroom selfies of some of my favorite fungi finds, including mushrooms that I'll talk about today. So up on the left, you see me with my favorite mushroom, the destroying angel. There's some pictures of me with boletes and lots of chanterelles, and also you'll see some like cubensis and some Amanita muscaria. So one of the things I love about mushrooms is that they're all over the world, and that there's a lot to learn from other cultures and how they relate to mushrooms. So this summer I had the privilege of traveling to Mexico with mycologist Alan Rockefeller and a group of mycophiles from the US and Mexico. And so here we are at the Wild Mushroom Fair in Coahuila-Moyas, Oaxaca. And so Oaxaca is one of the places where the mushroom is considered sacred to this day, and so I'll share some of the art from this region as well. And this photo here is where we're taking part in a competition where we broke into small groups, and we had about 2 hours to go out and find the most diverse amount of mushrooms. And so our group placed third, and we found 113 different types, and the winning team found over 150 types. And many of the mushrooms, incidentally, were tiny, and there were also a lot of really young children on the team. And so this is a video from my favorite part of that same festival. So here are some of the children in the village performing their annual rain dance. And this time of year, before the rainy season all over Oaxaca, the indigenous people, known as the Cloud People, do dances to ask the rain gods to bring fertility to their crops, to corn, squash, mushroom, and really all of life. And so this tradition of dancing this time of year goes back to before the Spanish arrived. So this photo is from the same trip where we went about 10,000 feet into the mountains of the state of Veracruz to forage mushrooms for our dinner that night. So we found a lot of edible boletes, a lot of Amanita muscarias, and they grew kind of under these like bunching grasses. It was really beautiful to see. And so one of the girls in our group, she emojied our heads with the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is, as you see, it's so common. It's commonly found everywhere in art. That it's now like the icon for a mushroom. And so you'll also notice, and you'll see this pattern throughout like early art, this sort of mushroom head, or sort of mushrooms being part of like sort of anthropomorphizing humans. And so you'll see this a lot throughout the presentation. So enough about me. I'm going to get into talking about fungi and its relationship to art. So while it might not be immediately apparent, if you start to look closer like I did for this video, you'll see it everywhere. And as I started to like do this mushroom hunt, digging into all this research from historical scholars, I was just overwhelmed. There's just so much. And so I found everything from prehistoric depictions such as cave paintings to petroglyphs going back to about 40,000 years. And so I only was able to like make my way up to about the European Renaissance, where artists began to use oil paints. And so I'm going to do a future video on fungi and its relationship to art, like once we get into the war on drugs and the modern contemporary age. And so I'll talk about interpretations and contemporary art and culture, including movies, video games, street art, and fashion. And so I'll add that sometime in January. So as I go through the presentation, you'll see that early visual language was found in both the Old and New World, and as we interpret the art, you will see that these mushrooms were sacred and they were really a central component of religious ceremonies of early ancestors. And so we notice that this art and rituals have many parallels to both sides of the globe, and so look out for these patterns. And so here are a few of the mushrooms that you'll see a lot in this presentation. So we see, the Amanita muscaria, which grows all over the world. Also, a different variety of psilocybin, cubensis here, and cyaneses here. I'm going to move across the globe in somewhat of a timeline and note that I will be using modern naming conventions of countries. Sometimes I'll jump around the timeline and throw in some modern anecdotes that relate to now, that sort of relate to this history going back centuries. And so, as I was putting this together, I felt that I had wished that I'd learned art this way, considering that fungi really is foundational to our evolution as a species. And so I thought it was a really great perspective, and I really hope that this video inspires you to learn even more about the fungi kingdom. So we're going to jump right into this, and we're going to start in India. So the earliest rock art was depicting mushrooms. It's from about 40,000 years ago in eastern India, where the cow is sacred. So psilocybin cyanesis, shown here, is commonly found in the Indus Valley, where these petroglyphs were found. And so these trace depictions shown here appear to be mushroom people, sort of these anthropomorphized people, like mushroom-shaped heads, or perhaps they were the shamans in the crowd, or in the tribe. And so you see here on the right here, there's a like some sort of human stick figure holding what is like a pointy-shaped mushroom. And so the Rig Veda that we see here is one of the world's oldest religious Sanskrit texts, and it refers to the legendary food of the gods known as soma over 100 times. We're told that drinking soma provides great physical strength to pick up the earth itself and the power of flight to go beyond the limits of heaven and earth. And we know that soma was a focal point of the Vedic religion of this time, and that drinking soma produced immortality. And so the gods that drank soma were believed to be immortal. And so we see this pattern quite a bit, especially since, there was little understanding of what fungi was, and, it growing alongside plants. The early peoples believed that it was magical because it did not have seeds like other plants. And so the contents of the drink is really debated by scholars. Some people think that it's a combination of a bunch of things, like including plants, possibly hallucinogenic mushrooms like psilocybin, potentially the Amanita muscaria. And so we know from translations of the text that the Rig Veda describes soma as a small red plant having no leaves, lacking both roots and blossoms, and having a stem that is meaty and juicy. So it sounds like a mushroom, but this is highly debated, as I found when I was doing my research. So here, as time went on, mushrooms continue to appear in this religious art. So here we see some ceramic female fertility figurines that are also from this region, the Indus Valley, for about the 3rd century BCE. And so they depict multiple Amanita muscaria mushrooms in the headdress of the earth goddess. So now we're looking at a figurine of Buddha under a mushroom. And so most of the depictions of Buddha is underneath the Bodhi tree, which is a semi-green tree. And so, according to the legend, Buddha eventually reaches nirvana and enlightenment underneath a Bodhi tree. So, but only after he dies of eating a poisonous meal. And so it's debated by scholars whether or not this mushroom was, this last meal was mushroom or wild boar. I don't know of a wild boar that's poisonous. Maybe spoiled meat, but, mushrooms are highly toxic, or some mushrooms are toxic. So, we have to sort of question these sort of things. And so here are several more figurines of Buddha, and again, we see this mushroom replacing where the Bodhi tree is, which represents the tree of life, so immortality. So this interchange of of seeing a mushroom instead of the Bodhi tree, we sort of see this pattern again of the mushroom representing immortality and eternal life. So above are a few different depictions of Shiva, the auspicious one, and the supreme being in the Hindu religion who creates, protects, and transforms the universe. There are many depictions of this goddess and what appears to be, Amanita muscaria mushroom. So murals in ancient India from around the 17th century depict shamans wearing clothes that are patterned after the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And so we're going to see this pattern a lot, like, in different cultures. So now we're going to move on to almost the North Pole, to about 10,000 years ago, where petroglyphs were found in Far East Siberia. So again, we see the figures with mushrooms on their heads, sort of this, kind of anthropomorphized depiction again. And so you'll make out not only the hemispherical mushroom caps of like an Amanita muscaria above the females, but you see this sort of pointy-shaped mushroom head on the males. And so that look more like a psilocybin mushroom. So Amanita muscaria is told to be toxic in the West, and in Siberia they're still consumed by various tribes during shamanic rituals to this day. And so observing this sacred ritual was really difficult for a long time for curious Westerners. And so we know that, we now know that Amanita muscaria can be consumed by drying the mushroom to remove the neurotoxin, ibotenic acid, and converting it to muscimol, which is the sort of deliriant psychedelic. And so this illustration here is depicting a shaman in Siberia, and it was created by the Dutch explorer Nicholas Whitson in the late 17th century, and it's the earliest depiction that appeared in Europe, and so it popularized the term shaman. And so also take note of the horns that appear on this shaman, because this is going to come up in later down the line. So in the 18th and 19th century, travel writers and natural scientists from the West described the ritual. The most famous account was by Oliver Goldsmith in 1762. And so to quote Goldsmith verbatim, the poorer sort, who love mushrooms to distraction, as well as the rich, but cannot afford in the first hand, post themselves on these occasions around the huts of the rich and watch the ladies and gentlemen as they come to pass their liquor, also known as urination, and hold a wooden bowl to catch the delicious fluid, very little altered by filtration, being still strongly tinctured with intoxicating quality. Of this they drink with the utmost satisfaction, and thus they get as drunk and as jovial as their betters. And so this is describing the sort of the hierarchy in these tribes, in which the wealthier were able to partake in the ritual of eating the mushroom on its own, and then the lower class citizens, they then would drink the urine of the upper class people. Pretty strange. And I don't think that happens anymore. But so reindeer also consumed Amanita muscaria. So writers reported that reindeer urgently sought out human urine, and this greatly helped in their domestication. And so this shaman shown here watched their reindeer's behavior after eating a fly agaric mushroom. And so one of the side effects is this of ingesting the mushroom is a sensation of flying. And so it's a pretty beautiful photo of the reindeer flying with its owner. So the Siberian people, we know, also ate dried venison, around this time of year when the Amanita muscaria mushrooms would come up. And so apparently it also helped them in their journey of expanded awareness. And so their spirit journeys were not necessarily about escaping reality or getting high. Instead, they use their journeys to seek wisdom and the knowledge of their ancestral spirits, the animals, plants, and the natural world that gave them life. And by connecting with the spiritual aspect of the world, they gathered information that helped them learn when to hunt, when to gather, and when to move to other locations, and how to treat illness of body and soul. So here we see a seventh generation shaman. Her name is Tatiana Yurkichin, and she also wears the colors of the Amanita muscarias. So there's some great videos online of her talking to people that are coming to this part of the world and learning about these mushrooms and the rituals. So here are a few more examples of shamans' clothing from different tribes in Siberia. And on the right is a the full sort of uniform, including the horned headdress that has these sort of strings or beads and ribbons that cover the eyes. And so it was important in the ritual for the shaman to not be looking at their patient. So by studying the history and the traditions of the Siberians in this early art and period of history, we can see how these ancient rituals may have been appropriated into the myth of Santa Claus and the Christian holiday associated with it. And so, you know, this holiday is more about consuming the material world rather than communing with nature. And so everything from the location of the North Pole, the timing of the winter solstice, the reindeer flying, the red and white colors, finding gifts underneath the conifer tree, which were, you know, originally mushrooms because they grow under conifers, the amanitas grow under conifers, to the rosy cheeks, which is a side effect of consuming Amanita muscaria, to going down the chimney, which is how the shamans entered the huts in the winter because the yurts would be so, you know, it would be so snowy that the snow would go all the way up the side of the yurts. So it's easier to just climb in through the chimney, to placing the ornaments on the tree or the mantle, which was how the shamans dried the mushrooms, which was necessary to remove the neurotoxin. So here's a short video from the BBC show Weird Nature, where we can learn more about reindeer's appetite for this intoxicating fungi. So now we're going to go to the Sahara Desert in Africa, to a vast plateau in southeast Algeria. So Salini in Algiers is a national park and UNESCO World Heritage Site. And there we find the bee-headed mushroom man, Matalem-Amazar. And it's painted on a large grouping of cave rocks dating back about 7,000 years ago. And so there's a lot of debate on what is happening in this beautiful depiction with mushrooms. And so one of the kind of most agreed upon and more recent interpretation is by Earl Lee in this book called named From the Body of God, Psychoactive Plants and the Cults of the Dead. It was written in 2012. And so it refers to an ancient episode where a mushroom shaman was buried with his clothes, and when unearthed sometime later, his body was covered with tiny mushrooms growing in his clothes. And so there are varying hypotheses on what this image really is. And so what makes, you know, we see the horns again above the what appears to be some sort of like bee mask or bee head. And so yeah, so, you know, if you're familiar with Paul Stamets, he uses this sort of bee mushroomed man in a lot of his talks when he talks about his discovering solutions to colony collapse disorder. And so, you know, one of the things that we can learn from observing and trying to interpret early art is try to learn from these ancient people and like what they understood about the relationship between fungi and the bees. And so here's a short video on Paul's research. And so also be sure to check out the bee mushroom feeder, which allows bees to feed on the potent combination of fungi and help build up their immunity. And so if you go to beemushroom.com, you can learn more about this pilot program. And the idea is to give away these bee sort of feeders that are much like kind of hummingbird feeders, but they're designed for bees. Like they can go through like a little maze to get this like potent combination of fungi. So we're moving now to Egypt, to about 5,000 years ago when the pharaohs ruled. So in ancient Egypt, mushrooms, the ancient Egyptians called mushrooms the sons of God, or the plants of immortality, because they did not have seeds or grow like normal plants. And so they believed that the storm god Set created mushrooms by hurling lightning bolts at the earth. And so here we see some various hieroglyphs from about 4,600 years ago depicting Set, the storm god, with the horn, like giving mushrooms to the pharaoh. And so it looks sort of like a cup shape, but if you look closer, you really sort of see how it could be a mushroom. And so, kind of changing topics a little bit, we know that it was common belief in various cultures that mushrooms came from lightning. And in many cultures, including Japan, the Japanese, they've been cultivating mushrooms for a long time, considering it's such a small country. And they've also been doing these experiments where they inject electricity into cultivation plots or even mushroom logs. And so several years back, in 2007, there was a 4-year study done where they injected 40 volts of electricity into a variety of mushrooms in their cultivated plots to see if this electricity would make them grow better. So in this picture here, you see on the right, you see with electricity, and on the left, you see without. And so 8 out of the 10 varieties multiplied. And the shiitakes had the best outcomes. So here you see without stimulation of electricity, and below with. And so I think that, we sort of hear these kind of, stories of people believing things that seem outrageous, like your God is throwing lightning and it grows mushrooms. But, we kind of see that, like, these things are have real practical effects. So back to Egypt now, where we know that despite it being a desert climate, mushrooms were cultivated on barley. And so eating mushrooms was also an exclusive privilege of pharaohs, and it's, whose well-documented belief in their own divinity and immortality was by consuming psilocybin cubensis. And so common men were forbidden from even touching mushrooms. And so we see this tablet on the left, which is the law basically that explains this. And on the right, you see another, some more hieroglyphs of a female pharaoh with these sort of mushroom shapes and some different grains behind her. So the pharaoh Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza about 4,500 years ago, loved truffles and made sure that the royal table was supplied with this rare desert-born fungi. And so the same desert truffle is also mentioned in the Quran. And so, here's some photos too of people foraging these fungi that are found in the desert. So they've run about $20 a pound in the Middle East. And I don't know if there's been, I've done a little bit of research, but I don't think there's been many people looking for desert truffles in the United States, but I think it would be interesting to look for. So in the oldest Egyptian writings, the pyramid text, it references an unknown red golden plant used in sacred rites. And in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, they are called the food of the gods, or celestial food, or the flesh of the gods. And scholars who had studied this closely believe that as a reference to Amanita muscaria or psilocybin. And some people also believe that the ankh is also a symbol of the mushroom. So here we see, the Set god giving a mushroom or putting the ankh in the mouth of the pharaoh. So this is debated, but mushrooms again were found all over Egypt, and so in the book Mushrooms of Mankind, James Arthur says that a lot of the pyramids or tombs in ancient Egypt are shaped like giant mushrooms. So here we see what looks like a wall relief of like a mushroom basket, maybe some sort of receptacle where they're growing mushrooms, and we know that they grew mushrooms in barley, so maybe that's what that depicts, some sort of receptacle where they grew mushrooms. We see another in the center here. We see a mushroom relief at the Edfu temple, and on the right are pillars of a fan of oyster-shaped mushrooms at the top of the Temple of Philae. So a variety of ancient Egyptian texts and artwork even hypothesize that the stages of the crown, which represents the hierarchy of the pharaohs, designated different stages of psychedelic mushrooms. So here at the top we see the white crown, which includes like a pinning, you see the pinning psilocybin cubensis. And then below here we see the white crown, which is sort of representative of like mushrooms at a different stage of growth. So this is debated, but I found it to be interesting. So now we're going to move to Mexico and Central America. So over the years, scholars had found an abundance of archaeological evidence supporting the proposition that in Central America, the cultures of South America and Easter Island shared, along with many of the New World cultures, elements of this mushroom-based belief system, and like the Vedic god of Soma was used in their practices. And so here are two different figurines from two different parts of the world showing the earth goddess, or fertility figurine, with what appears to be an Amanita muscaria on her head. So here's another example of a figurine from India and Mexico, and the study of mushroom symbolism in ancient religious art would suggest that the religion Soma, as well as other Vedic traditions, migrated to the Americas sometime around 1000 BCE. And so the Indians in the New World modeled their religion on Vedic beliefs and ritual practices. So we see here another, on the right we see a image, a figurine from Mexico, and on the left one from India. So while most accounts of mushroom use concern the Aztec, there is evidence the Mayan mushrooms used mushrooms in their ceremonial use. And, it's associated with these mushroom stones that are found in Guatemala. And so in the 1950s, there was a lot of archaeological sites and digging, and they found these stones that had, anthropomorphized like animals at the bottom, and had these sort of tripod shapes with animals. And so it's believed that these were symbols of dynastic power, and there's some old Quechua documents that talk about this. So here's another collection of these same mushrooms found in the same region. And, we see this same, like these effigies of jaguars on the base. And so we know that jaguar was a symbol of the underworld in the Mayan culture. And it also represented, the power to face one's fear and confront one's enemies, in the face of death. And so, we're going to see this jaguar come up later as well. So moving forward in time to about the 16th century in Mexico, here's a statue of Xochipilli, the Aztec prince of the arts and flowers. The statue was discovered at the slopes of a volcano in Mexico, and the glyphs and patterns, like in this figurine, depict psilocybin mushrooms in the hands, morning glory. There's also some depictions that represent tobacco. So here is some figurines that were titled the Weeping Gods. So at first glance, you kind of see these deities that appear to have like dangling eyeballs. But however, if you look more closely, you could potentially say that these dangling eyeballs were actually mushrooms. So above are male and female figurines from the Zacatecas culture of western Mexico, dating back to about the 2nd century CE, and the Amanita muscaria mushrooms on the head of the male and female of the male figurine on the left, and then on the breasts of the female figurine on the right. And so here are three more distinct figures, female figurines from the same area in Zacatecas. And so, we have to ask, we know that, mushrooms were associated with immortality and eternal life. And so it makes sense that they would encode the breasts on their figurines with these mushrooms, because we know that, from the breasts comes milk and life, essentially. So this is a Maya figurine that represents a bearded gnome wearing a hat which is believed to be an upside down or inverted Amanita muscaria mushroom. And so you kind of see this like veil shape as well. And in Mesoamerican mythology, the dwarf is related to Quetzalcoatl and guides the dead into the underworld. And so, maybe this figure represents the shaman or elder in the tribe. So now we're going to go to Peru, to pre-Columbian time, where many of the indigenous cultures lived for thousands of years before Spanish colonizers arrived. And so they worship the sun god Intu and Pachamama, the earth god. So this is a mirror from the Shimu culture of a shaman holding mushrooms in both hands. So this ceramic mask depicts the transformation of a human into a half-human, half-jaguar deity. And it was made by the ancient Olmecs as early as 1200 BC. And so we see the Amanita muscaria mushroom with the polka dots sort of encoded into the head and nose of the human side. And so again, this is this jaguar comes up again, which represents strength and facing mortality. So here's an archaeological site in southern Peru where there were a bunch of mushroom stones, and the purpose is still unknown. It's debated, like, are these mushrooms? Are they phallic symbols? It's Westerners like to say it's a fertility temple, and fertility rites took place here, but very little is known, but I found it to be interesting. So in the same region, there's a lot of like woven textiles that are from the southern part of Peru, where the Paracas culture lived around 750 BCE to 100 CE. And so this textile here incorporates what appears to be mushroom iconography associated with the ceremonial acts. And in the other hand, you see this bodiless human head being held up. And so we're going to look at a few more of these ceremonial axes. So it's called a tumi, and it's both a tool, and it was also a symbol that was created with metals. And so, we know that this tool was used in a ritual of human sacrifice to appease their goddess of earth, Pachamama. So here's a few more examples of the axe. Some older actual axes that were used, and then it represented in the textile art. So there's plenty of evidence of this so-called trophy head cult in the archaeological record in South America. And so Andean researchers, they found a large number of decapitated heads at an archaeological site of Tihuanaco, which is near Lake Titicaca. And so at this dig site, they uncovered several dozen decapitated heads that were arranged in this sort of geometrical pattern, and alongside it were these drinking vessels that are believed to be the vessels where they drank this sort of elixir, this sort of soma elixir, as part of the sacrifice. And so, it's important to understand that these rituals were offerings to the god, and that human sacrifice was always consensual. I know that's hard to comprehend in our society, but we'll get into this a little bit later on. So here is the moche ceramic vessels. They're created by the moche culture in Peru. And they depict, again, like shamans with mushrooms on their heads. Here's a few more. You know, we see this pattern again of the polka dots. Or on the left here we see a shaman with, or a warrior with what looks like an upside down mushroom. So here is a ceremonial vessel that also has these sort of like mushroom-like figures on the ears. So this is a gold figure that was found at Machu Picchu, and it was stolen by Brigham Young when he thought he discovered Machu Picchu about 100 years ago. And above the eyes you see here are what look to be mushroom sort of shapes. And so, you know, for a long time these artifacts were stored at Yale University, and a few years ago these were returned back to Peru. So now we're going to go to Bolivia, to the Lake Titicaca region, where the Tiwanaku people lived about 400 years ago, or 400 Common Era. And so this is very close to, this is basically the same region that we saw a lot of the previous art. So this is a beautiful hammered copper applique, and these were worn on over the clothing, sort of like pins. And it's covered in gilding in a variety of abstract, again, these anthropomorphic forms that appear to be mushroom-shaped people. And so the leftmost figure is a depiction of Pachamama, and she's the goddess of earth, and exalted by many, you know, the ancient Andean people. And so her radiating crown and rectangle head make her a stylized presentation of great reverence and fear among the ancient peoples in this region. And so it is believed that not satisfying her and bringing human sacrifices and offerings would bring devastation to the land. So now we're going to go to Colombia, where, you know, the Incans valued gold over all other metals, and they equated gold with the sun god Inti. And so gold was commonly found in artifacts from everything from jewelry, funerary ware, building materials, and of course sculptures of deities. So here are a couple of examples of these mushroom-shaped deities and shamans. So here's another gold mask with these sort of mushroom shapes encoded into the top, and this you know, was worn by like a priest or elder in the village. So here are some more mushroom-inspired gold ornaments. So most likely they were worn on the head by a ruler or priest, and the ornaments bear a metaphorical shape of the half-sliced mushroom again, or also or the ritual axe. And so you see this also sort of dotted, spotted pattern that represents the Amanita muscaria. So now we're going to go all the way across the ocean to Europe, to the country of Spain. And so we'll start at the prehistoric archaeological site of Selva Pascuala, which has about a 6,000-year-old painting of mushrooms and other creatures. So zoomed in a little bit, we can see these shapes a little better. And so Juan Raiz, an expert at the site, and late mycologist Gustan Guzman from Mexico, the leading authority on psilocybin, suggests that there was post-Paleolithic use of psychoactive fungi. And so this mushroom is believed to be Psilocybin hispanica, which grows in the area. And it's believed that the Saharan tribes of North Africa, you know, might have been using fungi when they lived in this region about 9,000 BCE. So now we're going to go to Scandinavia, to Sweden, where we're going to look at the Torslunda plates, which were found about 100 years ago. And so in Old Norse writings, it describes the Viking berserkers, which are depicted in these plates. And they were fierce warriors who were known for battling in an uncontrollable trance-like fury and were alleged to be able to perform seemingly impossible superhuman feats of strength. They would howl and growl like beasts, froth at the mouth, and launch an attack in a fit of frenzy. Some scholars propose that certain examples of berserker rage had been induced voluntarily by consuming these Amanita muscaria mushrooms or alcohol. And so, you know, these plates date back to about the 6th or 8th century and were found in Sweden. So some people, you know, sort of look at the collection of old Viking swords, and, you know, they appear to have these sort of mushroom shapes on the handles, and, you know, we have to question, like, does this further support the theory that this is what they consumed when they would fight? So now we're going to go to ancient Greece, and here we find evidence of mushroom use in the Eleusinian mysteries. And so this was an annual event that lasted about 10 days and ran for about 2,000 years. And this might be why the agrarian rituals and rites were kept secret among members. And so, you know, influential personalities like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle also took part in the initiations and secret ritual rites. And so, since the mysteries involve visions and conjuring up the afterlife, some scholars believe that the the power and the longevity of the Eleusinian mysteries came from using psychedelic drugs in these rituals. I don't like the word psychedelic drugs, but that's what the scholars called them. So on the vine appears to be dotted mushroom shapes with dots. And so, you know, they look like mushroom shapes. They could be grapes, but it's just one idea. So here is, you know, part of this ritual and the sacred rites, you know, it involves different deities and characters from Greek mythology. And so here we see Persephone, who's the daughter of Zeus. She also represents the queen of the underworld, and she's inspecting a mushroom with her mother. And this relief here depicts a psychedelic fertility ritual in the annual celebration where Hades, who is the god of the underworld, abducts Persephone. And so the myth of her abduction represents her function as a personification of vegetation and regrowth in the spring. And so I find it interesting that they're holding these mushrooms which represent kind of immortality. And so, you know, they represent, you know, these gods and goddesses represent death in the underworld. And so taking these mushrooms helps them regrow and spring. So sort of a cycle of nature, you know, and, you know, this was a period of time when agriculture was just, you know, was, you know, common in Europe. So moving down to France, to the early part of the Dark Ages, there was a lot of Gnostic and early Christian art depicting mushrooms. So the symbols and rituals had many parallels to the Hindu Rig Veda religion and the ritual of drinking soma. And so here we see a fresco mural of Adam and Eve with the tree of knowledge from a 12th century chapel in France. And so they appear to be sort of partaking in some sort of communion with the mushroom, with the entheogenic psychoactive fruit, also known as Amanita muscaria. And so, you know, we have to question, like, where did these belief systems come from? And so early Christian and Gnostics, they dealt not necessarily in concepts of sin like we know today in the Christian religion, but they dealt with concepts of raising consciousness and to help, you know, decide and make good decisions. And so they were all about enlightenment and overcoming ignorance. So here's another fresco titled Jesus' Entry into Jerusalem, and this is found in a church in France as well. And so same sort of period, you see some mushrooms on the right above the children that are greeting Jesus as he enters Jerusalem. So now we're going to talk about the Canterbury Psalter, or as some people call it, the psychedelic Bible. And so this is a 12th century manuscript with detailed illustrations of the Old and New Testament. The manuscript is over 184 pages back and front, and we see in it holy sacraments depicted with psychedelics, including the blue staining psilocybin and the Amanita muscaria. And so here again is Adam and Eve at the tree of life, choosing the serpent, which in the Gnostic religion and many other ancient religions around the world means wisdom and eternity of the soul. And so yeah, in the center here we also see them with what appear to be these psilocybin and amanita mushrooms. So here we see various panels of Jesus with mushrooms, especially on the right. We really see these sort of psychedelic looking patterns. So dozens of pages depict these stylized tree sort of trunks that look very much like mushrooms, or mushroom sort of trees that integrate dramatic scenes showing humans interacting with angels and demons. And here's a very apocalyptic scene depicting Christ and the apostles. It looks like maybe at the Ascension, with some very like swirling and interesting detail patterns. So here we see another scene with Christ, and he's being offered a mushroom with a antlered shaman in a mushroom grove. And in the center we again see this early depiction from the Dutch explorer Nicholas Whitson from the 17th century. So we have the 12th century on the right, 17th century in the center, and then on the right we see a modern black and white photo of a shaman from Siberia. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, through time, the early Christian religions and Gnostics were persecuted and their belief systems were considered heresy. It really integrated these early rituals that were from, indigenous regions and early peoples. And there was a lot of, partaking in these psychedelic mushrooms. And so the concept of the horned devil or Satan evolved pictorially and through religious teachings, especially once Christianity continued to move west. We continue to see these images of like the evil horned devil or Satan. And so over time, through the Crusades and the Dark Ages, as it continued through Europe, pagan festivals such as the Druid winter solstice, the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, and the Roman Saturnalia were replaced with the Christian holiday of Christmas. And materialism began to dominate the natural world, and it replaced the communion with the natural world. And so the communion became, materialism overtook the world in the West. And so you can now buy this psychedelic Bible online. So the manuscript was originally published in 1909 by Cambridge, and it was totally devoid of any of the psychoactive mushroom imagery. And so thankfully in 2002, the Spanish publishing house Malaria published the exact copy of the Canterbury Psalter, including the natural blemishes of the original pages, which are in Paris, France at the National Library. And so here's another recent book from 2016 on this topic if you're wanting to get into this a little bit more, where you can follow not only the evidence of mushrooms being used in early Christian, but all the way into like the Middle East. So now we're going to talk about Saint Nicholas of Bari. and he was an early Christian bishop in the ancient Greek maritime city of Myra during the time of the Roman Empire. And he had this reputation of giving away gifts. He was known for helping very poor people, and so this sort of secret gift giving is what a lot of people believed became the traditional model of Santa Claus or Saint Nick. And so we also see, that Saint Nick also has a lot of the same motifs of shamans, the red and white patterns. And so, we have to ask, were some of these motifs, did it help ease people, especially indigenous people, into another belief system? So to add even more controversy, these are some more depictions of St. Nicholas of Bari, and where he appears to have dark skin. And so we have to ask, could Santa be from Africa? And so, these are, various depictions from different places all over Europe, mostly Italy. But we have to ask, why in some depictions does he have darker skin? So yeah, Megyn Kelly is going to need a little extra rum in her eggnog. So, as Europe went into its little ice age around this time and the Dark Ages began, we see this tapestry from about the 14th century, where we see, and this is a tapestry that can be found in a castle in France. We see some mushrooms at the foot of the horse. So this is titled "The Black Horse and Famine of the Panel of the Apocalypse." And we see the serpent and, what looks like some sort of tree with grape-like figures on it. A lot of interesting detail. So here we see a couple of paintings titled "The Three Ages of Man" and "The Three Graces." And they depict, this is from about the 15th century, and they depict women in their three ages of life with the tree behind them that appears to be dead and decaying. And so this was done by a German painter, and so you see these sort of polypores on the dead trees, and so adds a real somber touch to the scene. We have to ask kind of what was going on at this time. This was during the again during the little ice age, a really dark time in Europe. So this is a playful oil painting titled "Autumn" by an Italian painter, and he used fruits and vegetables and mushrooms to depict human heads. And every season he did a painting. There was one from spring, summer, winter, and also autumn. And so the autumn painting included these. So this playful painting from an Italian painter uses vegetables, fruit, and even mushrooms to depict a human head. So this artist did a series of paintings, one for each season, and in the fall, autumn season, he included mushrooms in the head, these sort of anthropomorphized faces. So now we're going to go to Turkey, or the area of Persia where the Islam religion is dominant. And so Islamic art and architecture reflects how how Muslims relate to the universe. So it is a spiritual representation of nature, not a reflection of art. This is intended to allow the artists and the practitioners who view the ornamentation to feel closer to Allah. And so Islamic art and architecture in itself is very psychedelic in nature, and rightly so. And so we also look at a series of illustrations from this time from an ancient Timurid manuscript from about the 15th century, where it recorded the Miraj, which is Muhammad's ascent into the heavens. And And so some people believe that this depiction here sort of represents use of the same sort of Amanita muscaria mushroom to have that sort of feeling of flying. But this is debated, of course. So both art and architecture in the Islamic world featured vibrant colors, intricate geometric patterns, and very kaleidoscope sort of psychedelic patterns. Here's a few more mosques from different parts of the world that have these very distinct patterns. And so it's interesting to note too that in 2014 psychedelic mushrooms became legal in Iran, but it requires that this is done with supervision, like with a priest or shaman. And so I find that to be, pretty interesting, considering there's a lot of criticism of different Muslim countries, and they don't drink alcohol in these countries either. So finding out this information was interesting. So our last stop will be Mongolia, where we see a carpet that was found in 2009. And so this is close to some of the same, close to India, close to some of the regions where, it's believed that this soma ritual took place, this drinking of this psychoactive elixir. And so it's debated, it's been debated for a long time whether or not it involved mushrooms. And so, these Russian archaeologists discovered this 2,000-year-old carpet buried in a chamber in Mongolia. And the chief researcher on this project, she believes that it is the psychoactive species of psilocybin cubensis. And so the depiction of bees on the carpet also points to the fact that the men are holding mushrooms, because honey is very much associated with the afterlife. Bees and butterflies were associated with the afterlife. And we also know that honey was used to preserve things, especially mushrooms, in this part of the world. So wrapping up, I had a lot of questions for myself, going through a lot of this early art. And one of the questions I had was what is the significance of the mushroom above the head of figurines and in cave drawings? And so, we know that, Terence McKenna's stone date hypothesis has gained popularity in more recent years, especially as there starts to be some decriminalization of psilocybin mushrooms. And so, now that we have more ways to visualize the brain function of these mind-expanding mushrooms, his hypothesis, suggests that the processing capabilities to rapidly organize kickstarted the human evolution and cognitive ability to even participate in art and language, and increase our increase the complexity of our tools that we use. And so, he coined the phrase, we sort of ate our way into higher consciousness by consuming these mushrooms. So, we still don't have any direct evidence that, early, the Homo erectus, were evolved, their brains evolved by eating mushrooms. There's just not enough evidence to prove this theory, but I think it's quite interesting. And so, it also, kind of on the same topic, thinking about, consciousness and what it is, Western scientists and physicists have still been trying to figure out, what's going on in the dark matter, and, is all living things consciousness, and, magnetic force, is that inside this sort of dark matter? Because we don't have a lot of ways to observe it. And, we look at some of these ancient rituals and religious ceremonies, and we have to ask, like, was it possible for, humans to collectively affect change through their practices? And so, studying art and history of mushrooms, like, we can learn a lot. And so if you're interested in learning more about noetic science, which is the study of global consciousness, I recommend checking out this website. And there's a lot of really great stuff online where you can really get into some galaxy brain kind of stuff on this subject. It started out really simple where, in the 70s, during the Cold War, there was a lot of resources put into trying to understand the mind and consciousness, and even be able to do things like mind control. And at the project that started at Princeton, they did this experiment where they had these just random number generators, and they would put a person in the same room with this random number generator and ask them to think of a number, and then it would stop the random number generator and try to see if they could find a pattern of it matching up with the human was thinking. And they were able to sort of find a pattern in that. And so their experiments have further expanded, and they've put these random number generators all over the planet, and they're able to collect data, and statisticians do all types of number crunching and try to find experiments. But they've found different patterns emerging when there's an earthquake at any place in the globe. So they'll find these patterns. And so there was even some really interesting activity in this project, got a lot of attention right around 9/11, because there was all these sort of irregular patterns emerging right before 9/11 happened. And so so give it a look, take a look at it. So another question I had was, how did these ancient practices, such as human sacrifice with the use of these mind-expanding mushrooms, relate to today? It's hard to comprehend human sacrifice in modern Western society, although in the age of climate disasters due to climate change become all too often, and people are displaced and die as a result, we must ask ourselves, when, there is a sacrifice that's happening. And incidentally, capitalists call areas destroyed by industrialization and pollution, they call these places sacrifice zones. And these are always areas where working poor and people of color live. So, we have to sort of, ask ourselves, like, were these ancient rituals in which they took part in mind expanding sort of rituals to further commune with the earth, and they were willing, and these people from these close-knit communities were willing to sacrifice their lives in order to appease their gods, Pachamama in this example. We have to ask ourselves, where people are being sacrificed in a sort of in a way that's like after the fact. It's not, there isn't this sort of like proactive nature of respecting nature. It's sort of like, well, let's just pollute everything, and if people die, we'll just call them, it's just a sacrifice zone. It's just part of the cost of doing business. And so that's, it's a pretty dark way of, the way the Western world treats the planet. It's just an expendable resource, and there's no intention or no way to sort of like mimic nature or try to create any harmony. So I think, studying this art and looking at this art, like, we can try to better understand how our early civilizations, like how they tried to create that harmony. So what can we learn from early cultures and how they treated death? And so, we saw these patterns of, people, that, saw life as like a cyclical pattern. you know, their energy did not die, you know, it went somewhere else. It became part of, like, you know, a spirit that was always accessible. And so I think that, you know, in Western society we're starting to maybe learn a little bit about, you know, this. So research at NYU and Johns Hopkins University has shown that psychedelic therapy involving psilocybin has been hugely successful in alleviating anxiety in terminally ill, and it's helped people move beyond this sort of fear of death. And so, you know, the research that was started several years ago, it's now expanding, and Johns Hopkins just received $17 million to start a center to use psychedelics to study the mind and do various therapies, including diseases such as addiction, PTSD, and Alzheimer's. So how can we respect indigenous people's relationship with the sacred mushroom? So, you know, of course, give back artifacts. I know there's a lot of student movements and activism around returning artifacts that were stolen. And so, you know, where we can be helpful in that area, we should do that. Additionally, you know, when you travel, I think it's important to kind of go in with the mindset that you're not there to be a hero of the story. You're there to listen and learn. And, you know, if you are going to partake in like ancient rituals, you know, don't go expecting to tell other people what to do or co-opt these sort of ancient rituals. And so this is a really great resource, not just for, you know, participating in shamanic travel or shamanic rituals, but also for people that, you know, want to just travel in general and do it in a way that's respectful and creates harmony with people around the world. So here are a few of the books that I mentioned that you can link to. Just a few more. Okay, and thanks everybody for watching. If you would like more information, you can follow me on Instagram or contact me at the email shown on the screen. Thanks for watching.